I'm Chris Wallace. Can a millennial mayor from the Midwest make the case to be the Democratic nominee to take on President Trump?
My name is Pete Buttigieg. People get tripped up on that, so they usually just call me Mayor Pete.
At 37, the youngest entrant in the field, rising in the polls, and now on President Trump's radar.
We have a young man, Buttigieg. Buttigieg.
But Buttigieg believes he has what it takes.
I've got more years of experience in government than the president, and more years of executive experience than the vice president, and more military experience than the two of them put together.
It's time to fill in the blanks about where he stands on the issues.
I do believe that a single-payer environment is probably the right answer in the long term.
Join the ranks of modern nations that have abolished the death penalty.
Climate change is a security issue, and we got to call it what it is.
Tonight, from Claremont, New Hampshire, a town hall with South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg as he continues his quest to make history. Stevens High School here in Claremont, New Hampshire, home of the 2016 state football champion Stevens Cardinals. And welcome to a Fox News town hall with South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg. I got to tell you, and you can feel it, this is a hot ticket. More people have shown up for this town hall than any of our previous ones. We have a lot to cover tonight, so let's get right to it and bring out Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Welcome to Claremont. You seem to have a lot of friends here ready to answer their questions.
Sounds good.
All right, let's start with Ray Curran. He's a school counselor here at Stevens.
Welcome to Claremont, Mayor Pete.
Thank you.
How do you overcome relative youth and inexperience against some of your rivals in the Democratic primary?
Thanks. So, first of all, thanks for having us. We really feel welcome in this community. And look, there's a lot of us running for president on the Democratic side, but I think it's safe to say I'm not like the others. And one of the ways in which that's true is actually experience. Look, there's something audacious, maybe even a little bit obscene, about anybody looking at the Oval Office and thinking that's a job they can just walk in and do, right? But every time we've sent somebody into that office, it's been a mortal. It's been a human being with a set of experiences and a set of aptitudes. My experience is that of being mayor, and I would say being a mayor in a city of any size in America right now is about as relevant as it gets. You know, I've literally got the 3 a.m. call to deal with an emergency. I know that this is a job, any government executive job, is not just about passing good policies, but it's also about managing, and most of all, it's a moral job. And that's the part I think we're missing today in the presidency. It's a moral office, not just a management office. And as a mayor, I think I have an understanding of that.
Mayor, Matthew Long, a college student from Duke, has our next question.
Great.
Matthew?
Hi.
In a party that rightly values diversity of candidates, how will your policies stand out and win the nomination?
Thanks. Well, as you said, it's a point of pride for the Democratic Party that we care about diversity, that we want to make sure that our leadership reflects the country that we serve. I've sought to do that in my administration as mayor. I'm doing that with the campaign team that I'm surrounding myself with. But as you said in your question, it's also not just a question of the makeup of your team. It's what your policies are going to be. And we need to make sure that this is an inclusive set of policies that's going to serve everybody well. For example, we know just by the numbers that if you're a person of color in this country, in many ways you might as well be living in a different country. You look at the rate at which black women are likely to die from maternal complications. It's about 3 times what it is for white women. That didn't just happen. And it's not going to get fixed without policies that specifically pay attention to how those racial inequities got there in health, but also in areas like housing, like employment, and of course the criminal justice system that frankly does not treat everybody the same. So whether it's an agenda for black Americans or whether it's making sure that LGBTQ Americans are protected, which is obviously a big concern right now with the policies and the behavior coming out of Washington, whether it's making sure immigrants are treated fairly, disabled people, women, just about every one of us in some way belongs to a group that could be marginalized if we don't have the right kind of policies to lift all of us up. And those are the kinds of policies we're going to be talking about throughout this campaign.
Mayor, if I can follow up with you, and particularly on Ray's question about your youth. You would, if elected, be the youngest president ever at 37. You say that your face, in a way, is your message, that you believe that this country needs generational change. One of the things you say is we need a president who's making choices for 2054, which is when you'll be as old as Donald Trump is now.
Right.
On the other hand...
It's always fun hearing that sink in a little bit.
Okay, well, let's have this sink in as well. You could also make choices for 2058, which is when you'll be as old as Joe Biden is now. So the question is, does it go for him too? Does the country need generational change among Democratic leaders?
Well, I'm not going to speak to any of my competitors and whether they ought to run, because everybody's got to make that decision for themselves. What I will say is I think I have a different kind of propulsion when it comes to dealing with these issues, because they're personal. You know, what the world is going to look like in the 2050s isn't just something I think about or write about or wonder about. It's hopefully going to be my life too. And that's why making sure we actually do something about climate change, making sure we actually have a fiscally sustainable path. I know it's not as fashionable in my party to talk about deficits, but you look at what the Republican Congress did, blowing $1 trillion hole in our budget with a tax cut for the rich that America did not need. These problems will be visited on the heads of not just my children and grandchildren, but me and people in my generation too. And I think it gives me an ability to speak to those issues.
But I'm not really asking you whether, obviously, Joe Biden is going to run, whether you think he should or not. But if the point is to have a president who's looking out over a long horizon, because they're as young as you are, and you say a president who you are not going to be as old as to 2054, perhaps is disqualified. Couldn't just say that for a president who is you're going to be as old as in 2058?
I don't think anybody's disqualified. The only disqualification related to age is if you're under the constitutional limit of 35. Look, I know people who are twice my age who are as vigorous as people who are half my age, but I do think there's a special value to generational change at a moment like this, because we're not just living through another election. I believe we're living through one of those transitions between moments in American history, as consequential as the one that brought us the New Deal or the dawn of the Reagan era, which I would argue is actually a 40-year period that has only now come crashing to a halt with the hostile takeover of the Republican Party by the current president. And it does call for that longer view. So everybody's got different attributes that they bring. One of the ones I bring, I think, is the possibility of that kind of generational shift.
One of the big issues that everybody's been talking about this week is that 8 states have now passed laws this year that sharply restrict a woman's right to have an abortion.
That's right.
And one of the people here, Rachel Osmanson, a PhD candidate in engineering sciences, has a question about that. Rachel?
Yeah, if you become president, what policies would you put in place to protect every woman, regardless of her zip code's right to have an abortion?
Thank you. So I believe that the right of a woman to make her own decisions about her reproductive health and about her body is a national right. I believe it's an American freedom. And I believe that should be enjoyed by women in every state. Now, being a Democrat with pro-choice values who lives and governs in a community in Indiana, I get that there are a lot of passionate views on this, a lot of people I care about. Even some of my supporters believe differently than I do, but that's what I believe. And I believe that the next president needs to be ready to protect those rights. First of all, and the simplest thing, is appointing justices and judges who recognize that that is part of American freedom. Another is to make sure that we're not starving America of resources, not just for that kind of reproductive care, abortion care, but all kinds of reproductive care. If we really care about women, if we really care about life, then we've got to make sure, from common sense sex education to access to birth control, that we're preventing many of those unwanted pregnancies from happening in the first place. There's a lot more, but I'll leave it there.
All right. Let me follow up about that, because there's been a lot of focus this week about the states that have voted to restrict women's rights. But there's also been a movement in the other direction. New York State also this year passed a new law which significantly increases a woman's right to an abortion. It used to be the exception was after, I think it's 24 weeks, to protect the life of a woman. Now the new law is to protect the health of a woman, which is a much more lenient standard. And I guess the question is, do you believe at any point in pregnancy, whether it's at 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 24 weeks or whenever, that there should be any limit on a woman's right to have an abortion?
You know, I think the dialogue has got so caught up on where you draw the line that we've gotten away from the fundamental question of who gets to draw the line. And I trust women to draw the line when it's their own life.
So just to be clear, you're saying that you would be okay with a woman well into the third trimester deciding to abort her pregnancy?
Look, these hypotheticals are usually set up in order to provoke a strong emotional...
But in fairness,
all right, so
it's not hypothetical. There's 6,000 women a year who get abortions in the third trimester.
That's right, representing less than 1% of cases.
I know, but 6,000 pregnancy.
Let's take ourselves in... Yeah. So let's put ourselves in the shoes of a woman in that situation. If it's that late in your pregnancy, that means almost by definition, you've been expecting to carry it to term. We're talking about women who have perhaps chosen a name, women who have purchased a crib, families that then get the most devastating medical news of their lifetime, something about the health or the life of the mother that forces them to make an impossible, unthinkable choice. And the bottom line is, as horrible as that choice is, that woman, that family may seek spiritual guidance, they may seek medical guidance, but that decision's not going to be made any better, medically or morally, because the government is dictating how that decision should be made.
Mayor, as you well know, and it's one of the reasons you wanted to hold this town hall here in New Hampshire and specifically here in Claremont, drug addiction is a major problem here in New Hampshire. In fact, it's a sad fact that New Hampshire is among the 5 states with the highest rate of opioid-related deaths in the nation. Our correspondent Molly Line has been looking into that. Here's her report.
Failure is not an option. Addiction is not our future. We will liberate our country from this crisis. Thank you.
That's the promise President Trump made more than a year ago when he visited New Hampshire, a state among the hardest hit by the opioid crisis. In 2017, there were 424 overdose deaths, more than twice the national rate, with a significant increase of cases involving synthetic opioids, mainly fentanyl. On the campaign trail here, 2020 Democratic hopefuls often argue the president has not done enough, offering their own ideas.
One of the worst statements he made when he was on the phone with the president from Mexico was refer to New Hampshire as, quote, drug-infested den. He just doesn't get it. We need to invest significantly more in treatment and research to deal with the crisis.
I propose that we have mental health and substance abuse treatment on demand. That's what I'm proposing.
First responders in Manchester are on the front lines of the epidemic.
We're seeing a little dip in overdoses. We're seeing a little increase in deaths. We're trying to keep these people alive, to give them a shot. So the way I describe it is just treading water.
Voters here are deeply concerned about the opioid crisis, and they consistently grill the candidates on this issue. Chris?
Molly, thank you. On this topic, our next audience question for Mayor Buttigieg comes from Alexis Godwa, who is a nurse practitioner. Alexis.
In my career, I've worked with patients from infancy through old age, including pregnant mothers struggling with substance use disorder and opioid dependency. With plans such as the CARE Act already proposed, would you support this? Do you have your own plan for this public health crisis?
Well, first of all, thanks for the work that you do, because medical professionals are on the front line. And maybe the best thing that's happened in this terrible opioid crisis is we've come to understand these kind of addiction emergencies as a medical issue, not just a moral issue, that it's some moral failure when somebody can't break that addiction. And it's also really important that we break the silence about this. I wonder how many folks here would be willing to raise a hand if somebody you know or a family that you care about has personally been impacted by addiction of some kind. That's That's more than half the room. So we've got to bring it out of the shadows. And I do believe the kind of legislation you're talking about is moving us in the right direction. We can do a lot locally, too, but we can't do it alone. Like in South Bend, of course, we made sure that our first responders were equipped with Narcan so that if they find somebody in a potentially lethal overdose, they can help bring them back. But if you wake up hospitalized after you've been brought back from an overdose, and you're told that we can get you signed up for some kind of rehab or treatment program, but it's weeks away, your life depends on whether you can make it through those weeks. That's why I think we need to fund more people to be trained as interveners, as helpers, to assist somebody in holding their hand through that process and reduce the backlog for getting into that kind of treatment. We also need to support medication-assisted therapy by funding more people being able to get qualified in it. It is life-saving. Again, we are talking about a medical issue, and it can be treated medically if we have a recognition, yes, in our policy, but also just in our culture, that addiction issues and mental health issues deserve to be treated on an equal playing field with physical health issues.
Mayor, we want to get, obviously, a lot of people here want to ask you questions. We want to get to more of them. You talked at the very beginning about fiscal responsibility. We want to turn now to Tyler Sweeney. He is the New Hampshire State Director of the Concord Coalition, which you may know is a nonpartisan group that focuses on debt and deficits and entitlements. Tyler.
Thank you. Recently, we reached $22 trillion in national debt. We're on track to reach $1 trillion in deficits as soon as next year. What would President Buttigieg do to restore fiscal responsibility and slow or stop the growth of our debt?
Well, first of all, you don't blow a hole in the budget with an unnecessary and unaffordable tax cut for the very wealthiest. So part of it's do no harm, right? But there are also proactive steps we need to take. We need to be smart about spending, just as I have to be as a mayor. You know, the city of South Bend doesn't have its own currency, so I don't get to print money in order to deal with the gap in the budget. We just have to figure it out. And I think we need a little bit more of that mentality in the federal government. But, you know, debt can play a role. Deficits can play a role, especially when you're doing deficit spending that pays for itself in the long run. Now, tax cuts for the wealthy don't do that. But investments in education, in infrastructure, in health, sometimes can. And so we should be honest about the fact that sometimes that's appropriate, but not if you have no vision of what kind of revenue is going to support it. And so when candidates, Democrats, go out promising, as I think we should, that we're going to have major increases in investment in things like education, health, and infrastructure, we also got to be willing to say where the revenue is going to come from. And it's why we really do need to entertain ideas like, I would say, a fairer, which means higher, marginal income tax rate on those earning the most, a reasonable wealth tax or something like that to make sure that people are giving back when they become enormously wealthy. Perhaps a financial transactions tax that taxes these millisecond differences in computer trades that people become enormously wealthy off. I'm not saying we ban them, but since it's not obvious how much real value they're adding to the economy, the least we could do is get some value for the American people. And also closing the corporate tax loopholes and incentives for offshoring that have it to where pretty much everybody in this room probably paid more, personally, in federal income taxes than some of the most wealthy multinational corporations like Amazon that made billions in profits and paid zero last year.
So we got a lot more questions coming up, Mayor, for you. We're going to take a break here, but we're going to ask you when we come back after the break, just to give you a little preview, how can you put together a coalition that can win the Democratic nomination, and how, if you'd become the nominee, would you take on President Trump? All of that coming up as we come to you live from Stevens High School in Claremont, New Hampshire.